Hello, everybody. I'm Jonathan, and this is Anabaptist Theology. I want to take a few minutes with you, and I'm going to answer a criticism that has come to me and about the Anabaptists. And that criticism is this: that Anabaptists have a low view of Scripture and a low view of theology, and because of that, they are not as a faithful tradition as other Christian traditions that have a high view of Scripture and a high view of theology. So thank you for joining me today. Let's look right into this. All right, everybody. I kind of want to give you a background about where I'm coming at with this and why and where I got it. I have now been teaching Anabaptist theology for about 2 or 3 years now, and over that time, I've spoken at a few churches and a few schools. And when I was visiting one of the schools that I was speaking at, one of the people there told me that one of the reasons why families are telling them that they're leaving Anabaptism is because Anabaptists hold a low view of Scripture and a low view of theology. So looking for a more theologically rich tradition, they left Anabaptism to follow another Christian tradition. And I want to answer this, and what's difficult for me in regarding this question is I was taught at Bible college to study how to study Scripture. I was given the tools that most scholars use today. The area that I lack is I don't read the original languages. I know how to use the tools for the original languages, but I don't read the original languages. But other than that, I have access to all the tools that most of the scholars use, and I have done plenty of writing, and I've discussed plenty of theology. And for me, in my testimony, it was theology that led me into Anabaptism. It was theology that led me into these circles. And what I find difficult is, for what it's worth, I was a very comfortable evangelical pastor. I was a very comfortable pastor. We had just gone through a church revitalization process. The church was doing well, and things were really moving. So things were well. And then I started getting confronted through the teachings of Scripture, particularly the Gospel of Mark, the commands of Jesus, and even the teachings of the epistles in the New Testament. I was reading them and said, if I took these without any personal bias, without any personal presuppositions of how it should be, how would I interpret these passages? And because of a rich, what I would consider a deep theological pursuit, where I would study for a long time, I could not avoid but become Anabaptist. It's not that I was excited about becoming Anabaptist. It's not that I was emotional about becoming Anabaptist. For me, I felt like a work of God through a theological pursuit that led me in Anabaptism. And when I heard this criticism saying, well, Anabaptists don't have a rich theological heritage, that really confused me. It confused me. And I just want to let you know that it doesn't matter which Christian tradition that you enter into, you're going to find churches that are theologically deeper, and you're going to find churches that are theologically more shallow. It reminds me of being a former Baptist. You had the more traditional side of Baptist, which was basically go to church, wear a suit and tie, be a good person, and make sure that you know Jesus. And the gospel was preached pretty regularly, very evangelistic. And then when someone starts listening to, like, let's say, Calvinistic preaching or Reformed preaching, which I am not, but usually those things have an appeal to those who are looking for a richer theology. They're looking for a more systematic approach to understanding the faith. And so they leave their traditional Baptist church, and what I mean by traditional theologically, and move into a more theologically reformed position because they feel like that's more theological. It's more consistent with the teachings of Scripture. It takes theology more seriously, and that really draws them. Now, a lot of those people who go into those circles eventually end up leaving those circles But there is an initial pursuit there, and they just grew up like, for me, I just grew up as a Baptist. I grew up believing the way Baptists believe. I grew up in a Baptist church here, listening to Baptist sermons. And so I know that appeal of wanting to listen to theologians discuss the deep things of God, deep theology that goes beyond the basic Sunday school lessons that you would get as a typical Sunday morning service. But the truth is, you're going to find shallow theology wherever you go. You're going to find shallow theology if it's a Baptist church, and there are even some Reformed Baptist churches that would pose as, oh, we're deep theologically, just for someone to go in there and ask some difficult questions that's not in line, just to find out that maybe the bold guy in the pulpit really is just a parrot who parrots what he hears from John MacArthur. It happens all the time. So I don't think that's a legitimate excuse. Now, let me explain to you a little bit of my experience in coming into Anabaptist circles. When I came into Anabaptist circles, I was confronted by this idea that that theology was limited in its pursuit. To pursue it was limited, and I want to explain to you why that is. Why do Anabaptists have a hesitation in making things too theological? Now, it doesn't mean that Anabaptists aren't theological, because they are. If you study the Reformation, the reason why there's not a lot of theological Anabaptist writings is because they were all burned and the people were killed by the Reformers and the Catholic Church. So when you have the Catholic Church and Reformers burning people at the stake and burning their writings, not a lot survives. And that's the reason why I think we make the mistake to think that Anabaptists are not theologically founded. Now, with that said, I want to say this. I want to give you some reasons why Anabaptists come across this way to other people. The reason why many Anabaptists come across as people who don't value theology or don't have a high view of Scripture, it's not that they don't. They have a very high view of the Bible, very high view of Scripture. And if you try to understand where they're coming from, it's going to start making sense of why they do what they do. And the first aspect of that is theology or doctrine is not just an intellectual pursuit. The difficulty with the Anabaptists and how they would view Christianity or their faith is they viewed Christianity as something that's lived out in their life. They viewed good doctrine or good theology as something they lived out in their daily experience, not just something they study in an ivory tower, okay? Where you had the Reformers or other theological traditions where the emphasis of theological understanding was prioritized over even certain levels of Christian living. So you have someone who can articulate 5 points of this theology or 8 points of this theology, but they weren't very good Christ followers. They weren't ministering to the poor. They weren't out living their life for the orphan and the widow. And the Anabaptists have recognized this, and they say, you know what? Theology is limited. The pursuit of theological understanding is limited because it doesn't necessarily produce the life that Jesus wants to accomplish in each of us. And that's a legitimate position in the sense that it is easy, and for me included, to go off into these theological pursuits of trying to understand every element of theology and how this verse fits with this verse and how this theology fits with this theology, and then forget about those things that Jesus did. And what they would argue is Jesus did spend some time debating theology with the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and Paul spent time debating theology with the Jews and the Gentiles. But then there was a large part of his ministry that was preaching the gospel to the lost and ministering to those who were in need. And the Anabaptists would say the pursuit of theology is fine. Theology becoming an idol in of itself that takes the place of the Great Commission and to live out good religion or the footsteps of Jesus is when theology goes too far. So it's not that they don't esteem theology, it's just that they understand theology within the context of living a life after Jesus in the world. So you're going to find Anabaptists who would say, yes, we need to study the scriptures and we need to study theology, but it's more important that we live good theology, that we live good doctrine, that we esteem the person of Jesus, and we live a life that one day he'll call us good and faithful servants, not just good and faithful thinkers. And it has portrayed to some that they just don't care about theology. And that's just not the case. That is not the case at all. There are many wonderful Anabaptist thinkers and theologians out there who are great at articulating their faith and edifying the church and encouraging the believers, and are great at doing things a whole lot better than I am. And they just see theology as a life, not as a life pursuit, not just a mental pursuit. And so whenever some people come across that, they're like, oh, well, you just don't take theology seriously, or you have a low view of Scripture. And that's just not the case. The case is we have a high view of Scripture, we have a high view of theology, but we have to view theology within the context of living out a faithful Christian life, because you could be the best theologian that's out there. If you're not living a faithful Christian life, then none of that really matters, does it? So with that answers, I feel like that answers the objection. The other things that people may misunderstand is Anabaptism has the same issues that evangelical has. There's a lot of mirroring here. There are wings of fundamental sides of Anabaptism which are extremely traditional, extremely, I hate the term legalistic because it's a very relative definition. Someone's legalism is someone else's liberalism, blah, 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 blah. But they're very strict and legalistic, and they have all these man-made rules that have nothing to do with Scripture at all, and it becomes a culture instead of a theological system or a Christian system. It becomes a certain culture, and you just join the culture. It's not really Christianity; it's more of a culture. And that does exist, and I'm not denying that at all, that there are many people out there who are living in a quote-unquote Anabaptist culture, and I wouldn't even call it Anabaptist. I would call it a strict culture that has all these man-made rules and strict guidelines that have nothing to do with what Scripture teaches. But the truth is we can look at many denominations and say the same thing. We could say the same thing. I would say the same thing about, no offense, extreme right-wing fundamental Baptists. Regarding, it has to be a piano and organ. There has to be an American flag. There has to be, be at church 3 times a week. I think we should be at church whenever we absolutely can. But those people, for some of them, they feel like if they're at church 3 times a week, then that kind of takes the place of any relational pursuit. And they go and they've never read, they don't spend any time reading their Bibles, but they go to church 3 times a week and they feel like they checked that off the box and now they're right with God. So the truth is it doesn't matter where you go to church, you're going to meet people and you're going to meet certain church groups that fall in that box, that of man-made rules and legalistic tendencies. The other thing is just because there are extreme wings of Anabaptism that doesn't prioritize theological understanding doesn't mean that Anabaptist system as a whole is unfaithful. And that's to be prejudiced like that and to be stereotypical like that, which I've met a lot of people who are. You really aren't doing yourself any favors because you're dismissing an entire theological approach, a Christ-centered approach to the teachings of Scripture, all because you've met a group one time that had all these legalistic rules. Now, with that said, because of my training, my background, and because I'm a little OCD, I love to study and I love to search out theology. And I've never been discouraged once since becoming an Anabaptist to tell me to stop studying, to tell me to stop pursuing the teachings of Scripture, that tell me to just join the culture and forget about trying to articulate my faith. Because as I've told many people, I'm going to live what I believe, and I'm going to believe, what I understand, and I'm going to try to understand the teachings of Scriptures to the best of my ability, have faith to be obedient to things I don't fully understand, but I'm going to esteem the teachings of Scripture. And personal experience, there have been some Anabaptist siding Christians that haven't always been real appreciative of me, but it hasn't been because of my pursuit of theology. I think it had more to do with struggling that someone like me, who is a former evangelical, could come in so easily and tell them what they believe. And I can understand that criticism. And the criticism would come back basically say, well, you've been here for just a few years. I've been in this my whole life, and you're telling me what I believe. And as I tell them, I say, I'm telling you what I believe and why I'm here, or why I'm preaching, and what I'm teaching and preaching. And I've encouraged those Anabaptists who have viewed me as such, as someone who is, maybe have not been real happy with my full-throated approach to theology, that if we don't articulate our faith from a theological position, then we're giving families and people a reason to leave our churches to go pursue those traditions that might have more theological, quote, theologically rich tradition. So no. Do I consider Anabaptists to have a low view of Scripture? Absolutely not. It was my esteeming of Scripture, my elevating of the teaching of Scripture, my understanding of theology that led me into Anabaptism. Not once did theology lead me out of Anabaptism. It was my pursuit of Christ and theology that led me into it. And so I don't think it's a fair criticism. And if you have maybe been prejudiced or stereotyped Anabaptists as being theologically shallow, then you need to look again, because we love theology. We love the teachings of Scripture. We esteem the teachings of Scripture. But we esteem the teachings of Scripture in light of the revelation of Jesus. And our understanding of godly doctrine is not just understanding deep theological concepts. It's about living a life that's pleasing to the Lord. It's about living out the elements of the Scriptures that pleases the Lord. It's about loving my wife well. It's about leading my children in the Lord. It's about loving my neighbor. It's about going out and ministering to the needs of the widows and orphans. It's about serving Jesus and living for his kingdom today. Is that a theological pursuit? Absolutely, that's a theological pursuit. Is it only a theological pursuit? No, it's not. Theology is not just something that you do inside your brain, inside of a tower or wherever, or a building, where it doesn't produce fruit in your life. Theology that doesn't produce fruit is not good theology. Good theology will produce fruitful obedience in your life. So do we have a low view of Scripture? Absolutely not. I love Scripture. In fact, I esteem Scripture. And I would encourage you that if you are an Anabaptist, or that maybe are struggling with this, you need to subscribe to this channel, because our goal is to pursue the deep theological elements of the faith. If you are an evangelical and you have been prejudiced against Anabaptists because you feel like we're not theologically, we don't esteem theological understanding, you need to subscribe to this channel, because our goal is to understand the deep things of God. Speaking mature thing or spiritually deep things is those who are able to receive it. And that's the goal of this channel, is to let you know that there is a rich theological tradition in Anabaptism, that there is a faithful interpretation of Scripture that doesn't just lead to a faithful, obedient understanding and a sanctified understanding of the mind, but a sanctified life that looks a lot like Jesus. Theology, what I love about Jesus is Jesus was theology with skin and bones. He was theology with footprints. I've said that over and over. He's theology with footprints. In Jesus, the theological or the spiritual intersected with the real. And that's what I love about Jesus, is you can't have a relationship with Jesus and stay in one of those two places. Either if you've had an encounter with Jesus, you will pursue everything to know him better and live out and try to understand his ways more and more. And at the same time, if you have had an encounter with Jesus, your life will never look the same. Our goal is to explore theology and then live it out in our lives in a way that pleases him, grows his kingdom, and gives God glory. So that's what I have for you guys today. You guys have a great day. God bless.